Chapter 39, The Stalemated 70s, 1968 through 1980. All right, so we're talking about the 70s, and the 70s, stalemated is probably the term you want to use. There's so much going on in the 60s. We have the civil rights, we have Vietnam, all of this stuff going on in the 60s. Our economic stuff is booming in the 60s, but then all of this kind of slows down in the 70s. All right, so intro. By the end of the 60s, as I mentioned, the economic boom started to peter out. Since World War II, our standard of living had doubled, so we had this huge growth of our economy. Standard of living is doubled, and then starts to stall. Okay. Our standard of living will stay the same for the next 20 years, and really the only reason it doesn't decrease is we start to see more and more women working outside of the home, kind of adding to that family income, kind of stabilizing the standard of living with that additional income. But now, in the 70s, people really are feeling America has limits. Okay, Section A, sources of the stagnation. Well, the whole idea here is it's still kind of a mystery why exactly this happened, and more or less it's a combination of a lot of different things. For example, when it comes to the workforce, we see a lot more teenagers and a lot more women working, and the jobs that they're acquiring are usually short-term, kind of low-pay, low-skilled jobs. We see a shift from manufacturing to our service industry, so less factory jobs, more kind of white-collar jobs, that sort of thing. So that shift messes with the system, so to speak. We see a decline in investment in new machinery. We see a lot of cost involved with complying with a lot of these new regulations that'll be put forth by the national government. Health and safety regulations, which are a good thing. They are expensive to keep that up. And, Vietnam is taking a lot of our money away from what we could be spending here in America. So instead of spending money on education, for example, we're spending money on bombs in Vietnam. In the 70s, and we'll see this will be a problem plaguing a number of presidents in the 70s, but inflation is out of control. Inflation means that things are more expensive than they used to be. The example I always use is like a pop machine, Coke machine, whatever have you. Like back in the day, you could get like a pop for 50 cents, and then it went up to $1, and now it's like $1.25. Inflation, things are getting more expensive, but inflation at a very high rate in the 70s, we'll see. And also inflation is caused mostly by, or in part by, all of this deficit spending that's going on. Deficit spending is spending money you don't have. So what was going on is Johnson, remember, his Great Society, War on Poverty, all of that costs money. Vietnam costs money. Those two things together cost a lot of money that we didn't have. So deficit spending. So what's happening is we're putting more money that we don't really have into the economy without putting more goods. So there's more money in circulation, so to speak, but there's less goods to buy. That puts a demand on the goods. That means since there is a high demand for these goods, they can sell them at a higher rate, right? There's only, one can of Pringles left in the store, they could sell that can of Pringles for whatever they wanted, because I would buy them, or not. I eat healthy, never mind. Okay, so deficit spending by funding the war in Great Society leads to inflation, which is, of course, one of the reasons our economy is not looking so hot in the 70s. And in fact, inflation got so bad that the cost of living tripled in the 12 years after Nixon becomes president. Other weaknesses with our economy. American business after World War II really didn't have a lot of competition because Europe was all in ashes and dust and smoke and kind of, nothing. So we didn't have a lot of competition, but now we're starting to have competition again. We're seeing Germany rebuilding, and they're just not rebuilding, okay factories. They were building state-of-the-art, very efficient factories. And our American factories, we're getting a little lazy. They're a little inefficient. They weren't really modern. So now we're competing with really modern factories that are being built like in Japan and in Germany after World War II. So that doesn't help us at all. And really, people are frustrated. We have a very stagnant economy. The war in Vietnam is still a thing. And we're really just kind of losing confidence in America. Okay. Section B, Section B, Nixon Vietnamizes the war. Okay. Although I didn't say that word right. What this section is talking about is, remember, the Vietnam War is supposed to be a civil war in Asia between North Vietnam and South Vietnam, but somehow the United States got involved in this mess. Well, now what Nixon wants to do is to give it back to the Vietnamese people, saying, hey, it's been real fun, we've enjoyed ourselves, but this is your war. We're going to hand you back the war and just kind of leave. So that's Nixon's game plan. Let's talk about it. Okay, so 1969, when Nixon takes office, people are torn over racial issues, people are torn over Vietnam, and he literally says, quote unquote, stop shouting at one another. Okay. And Nixon's personality doesn't really make him seem like a person who can kind of counsel people, bring people together. He's kind of like a lone wolf. Very paranoid, very suspicious by nature, so to speak. And really, he's a Republican, right? And we've had a Democrat in office for a long time. And he's been fighting these dang Democrats, these liberal Democrats who want to spend all this money, bring, all of these new programs to being. He's been fighting against these dang Democrats for a long time, and he's a Republican, and he's in office now, and he's finally going to get his way. That's kind of his idea, fighting against, or has a lot of resentments against, this liberal Democratic establishment. He's been fighting them his whole career. He's going to keep doing it. But really, the plus he brings to the presidency is clearly his experience with foreign affairs. He is very knowledgeable, lots of experience there, so that is definitely a plus, and we'll need that if we want to, leave Vietnam. Okay, so the first stop, once he's president, is to figure out Vietnam. And like I said, his policy is Vietnamization, that's how I'm going to say it. And that's the idea, is we're going to give the war back to the Vietnam people. We're going to, just kind of step out of this. So what he does is he withdraws 540,000 U.S. troops from South Vietnam over an extended period of time and allow the South Vietnamese troops with American support to take over. So giving the war back to Vietnam, still supplying them with stuff, just not people. So taking our troops out of Asia, about time. All right. And this was all, this idea is called the Nixon Doctrine. Nixon Doctrine, U.S. would honor existing defense commitments, like in Vietnam, but in the future they would stop sending over troops. We might supply them with needed war materials, but we're going to stop sending over troops. So that's the Nixon Doctrine. Okay. But the thing is, we still wanted to win the war. We still wanted South Vietnam to be victorious. We were just kind of overspilling American blood for it. So in October of 1969, 100,000 people jammed Boston Commons. 50,000 people gathered by the White House with lighted candles, and they held a national Vietnam moratorium, saying that there's still protesters out there. This is obviously a huge gathering of people, and it's kind of like a protest, but more of like a memorial for all of those who had died. Just kind of to show that it was still very unpopular. But Nixon, he thought, you know what? He appealed to the silent majority. That's a phrase you probably should, or might have heard of, I should say, the silent majority. He said, well, yes, we still have all of these anti-war protesters out there protesting the war. You know what? I think the majority of Americans still support the war. They're just not saying anything. So he called that the silent majority, people who presumably still supported the war. And Vice President Agnew and Nixon both really looked down, kind of sneered at these anti-war protesters. They called them bums. Nonetheless, by 1970, 40,000 Americans had been killed in Vietnam and over 250,000 were wounded, and it was grotesquely unpopular. So although they can call these anti-war protesters bums all day long, they can say, well, the silent majority agrees with the war, but frankly, they were wrong. Okay. And a huge part of this was most of the troops that were in Vietnam came from the really kind of the low class, the unprivileged folks of the world, because you were not involved in the draft, or you're excluded from the draft if you were in college or if you had skills that could be used, critical civilian skills that could be used kind of for the war effort, or like you had a good job, you were a productive citizen. So it was really the, the minorities like African Americans who were definitely overrepresented in the draft, and poor white American guys who were over there fighting. So it was the poor guys over there fighting while the rich college students just protested. Okay. And, things in Vietnam were not looking good. Morale was very, very low. There are rumors that soldiers were actually killing their own officers. And then there's this huge scandal that comes out, not Watergate, not yet, about Vietnam, the My Lai massacre, which this had happened a couple years earlier, but it came out during Nixon's first year or so in office. And what it was this was a village in South Vietnam where American soldiers had kind of just massacred 400 men, women, and children, so civilians. Just a savage massacre. Americans did this against the South Vietnamese, and this was just more fuel to the fire of the anti-war protest. So the My Lai massacre, Americans killing unarmed children and women, men as well, huge kind of fuel to the fire of the anti-war protest. All right, section C. Why are these words existing? Okay, Cambodiaizing the Vietnam War. I'll explain it. If I can't pronounce it, I better at least explain it. Cambodian, I can't even say it. Okay, so Cambodia is a country, right? Cambodia actually borders Vietnam. It's directly west of Vietnam, so they share a border. And what was going on? Of course, Cambodia had nothing to do with the Vietnam War. They weren't involved in it directly. They were neutral. However, what was happening is the Viet Cong, right, the North Vietnamese troops, the Viet Cong we're calling them, because that's what they're called. What they would do is they would go into Cambodia, kind of go south, and then use Cambodia as a springboard into which they could attack South Vietnam. So Nixon decides he wants to go into Cambodia and clear out all the Viet Cong who are using it as kind of like a springboard to jump into South Vietnam. Okay, so in April 29th of 1970, Nixon, without congressional approval, orders American forces to go into neutral Cambodia and to clear out the Viet Cong. This absolutely infuriates many Americans. Cambodia, as I mentioned, was neutral, and especially on college campuses, there were kind of almost some violent, there were some very severe protests. They responded by throwing rocks, smashing windows, arson, which means setting things on fire. And one of these riots, you could say, protest was getting out of hand in Ohio. Kent State University in Ohio, during one of these protests protesting Nixon's invasion of Cambodia, so to speak, the National Guard opened fire on a group of students, actually killing 4 students. So this is one of those huge things you just ought to know about. The Kent State University shooting. 4 students are killed. Could you even imagine that, like at Iowa or Iowa State, UNI, whatever? the National Guard opening fire on unarmed college students. That's just crazy. But it happened. Okay, so after 2 months of this kind of clearing out of Cambodia, Nixon finally says fine. So he withdraws his troops from Cambodia, but what this really does is this incident, once again, really is deepening the divide between the war hawks, people kind of for the war, the hawks, and the doves, people who want to get out of this war already. Okay, couple things to kind of just throw into the rest of this section. They mentioned that the 26th Amendment is passed at this time. The 26th Amendment, passed in 1971, lowers the voting age from 21 to 18. So the idea was that 18 was the age where you could be drafted. So it would only make sense that if you could be drafted to fight in Vietnam, you ought to at least have the right to vote. So the 26th Amendment lowers the voting age to 18. Okay. Also, something that comes out at this time in 71 is the Pentagon Papers. Ooh, sounds mysterious. Let's talk about it. The Pentagon Papers, they were actually published in the New York Times, so very publicly published. And what it was a top secret study that showed all of the blunders and deceptions of the Kennedy and Johnson administration. So a lot of the reasons we got into Vietnam, it showed that they were kind of deceiving us. For example, I kind of mentioned this before. Remember the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that Johnson had passed that gave him more or less a blank check to do whatever he wanted in Vietnam? The whole story behind that was supposedly that two American battleships, so to speak, were unprovokingly attacked by the North Vietnam troops, army, whatever you call it. So that was the story everyone heard. But now in the Pentagon Papers, we actually learned that no, there's actually not a lot of evidence to show that the North Vietnamese attacked us first. It was actually that the U.S. ships attacked the North Vietnamese, and they were attacking us in defense. So things like that were coming out to show that they weren't being super truthful with us, that federal government. So these were obviously a huge thing. You know, anti-war protesters, the doves, are just like, I can't take this anymore. You lied to us. Okay, Section D, Nixon's détente with Beijing and Moscow. Okay, remember détente means kind of lessening of tensions. Although this is not where the word comes from. Think of something that's taut. If you hold something taut, you're holding it tight. So if it's like détente, untightening it, it's like relaxing of tensions. Does that help? I hope so. So Nixon's détente with Beijing, meaning China, and Moscow, meaning Russia, are two big communist countries. So we figured if we wanted to have peace in Vietnam, that we needed to have some help. Okay. So what happens is Nixon decides to start talking with China and the Soviet Union. China and the Soviet Union had been clashing over kind of their different interpretations of Marxism, kind of Karl Marx, Communist Manifesto, the guy kind of invented communism, so to speak. Well, they were having some disputes over what kind of communism was the best. Anyway, even on their border, there had been some bloody skirmishes. So Nixon thought this would be a great opportunity to play one against the other, okay? To kind of warm up to one. And then once we're friends with that, say, well, China said this. Well, Russia said that. Kind of, you know, like when you want to get something from your parents, you kind of play one parent off the other. If you're a bad child, of course none of you are, so you don't understand what I'm saying. But anyway, let's keep going. Play one off against the other. So really, Nixon's closest advisor when it comes to foreign affairs was actually his national security advisor. And this guy's name is Dr. Henry Kissinger. Kissinger, very famous name. Ask your parents, right? So Kissinger was actually German-born and professor of political science at Harvard. He actually, like I said, born in Germany, fled to the United States when the Nazis were persecuting the Jews, became a professor at Harvard, that sort of thing. And so Kissinger was really the legs of Nixon, going around doing all of this stuff. Kissinger met secretly with the North Vietnamese in Paris to try to start working on peace terms. Nixon himself accepted an invitation to go visit China in February of 72. So this is kind of like a goodwill mission to go to China to kind of, lessen the tension, to try to kind of form some sort of relationship there. Because remember, after World War II, like 4 years after World War II, the communists took over China, exiling the nationalist leader to that little island called Taiwan. So we hadn't really been on good terms with China since it was, communist now. But Nixon wanted to change that, right? We're lessening the tension. So he goes over to China, goes to the Great Wall, eats some good food, chats, so to speak. And as a result of that, China and the United States agreed to normalize relationships, to start working on the relationship, so to speak. And in agreement to this, America agreed to recognize kind of the one China policy, saying that we're going to say that it's more or less we're going to back off Taiwan. Okay, remember Taiwan was that little island off the coast of China where all of those non-communist Chinese fled once the communists took over? Well, we agreed to kind of back off there and just recognize the Chinese government and mainland China as the official Chinese government. Like the official. Okay, I sound really intelligent today. Nonetheless, Nixon's next stop. He went to China, now he's going to Moscow, going to talk to the Russians in May of 72, so just a month or two later. And now that we had a friendly relationship with Russia's neighbor China, we kind of had some more cards to play. Remember playing one against the other. And the visit went well. There's a lot of things that happened, but it was definitely helped to usher in this era of relaxation of tensions. It won't last forever, but it lasts a little bit of time. A couple agreements. You don't really need to know the specifics, but just so you kind of understand what we were agreeing to. 3 years, we agreed to that for the next 3 years, the U.S. agreed to sell the Soviets wheat, corn, and grain because the Soviets needed food bad, so we agreed we'd sell that to them. Also, we agreed on an anti-ballistic missile treaty. Anti-ballistic missiles, of course, those are, or I should say ballistic missiles are kind of like nuclear missiles, sort of speak. So we agreed to an anti-ballistic missile treaty. And we also agreed to, in the future, have some talks where we could negotiate a reduction of arms. So we didn't actually negotiate the reduction of arms, but we said we'd go and have talks to help bring that about. And these are called SALT talks, okay? Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. And then we'll talk about SALT 2 at the end of this chapter. So SALT is the idea we're limiting arms. Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. Okay, so although we talked a good talk with Russia, both sides, though, kept, despite the treaty, kept on working on developing something called MIRVs, M-I-R-V. It stands for Multiple Independently Targeted Re-entry Vehicles. So although we said we weren't going to, we started to develop these things. And what they are, MIRVs, it's kind of like, think of like a shotgun shell. It's like one shell, but it has a lot of little pebbles. That's probably not, pebbles is not the right word, but little pebbles inside of it. So like if you're hunting ducks or something. Yeah, so it's one shell with a lot of little pebbles. Well, it's kind of like that for nuclear weapons. So it was like one thing, but had a lot of little nuclear missiles inside of it that could be targeted at different areas. So just this one missile kind of exploding in air had a bunch of little warheads that could go to different targets. So, yay, weapons of mass destruction. But nonetheless, we were both working on MIRVs. More on that later. Okay, so this whole section I was talking about, okay, détente, lessening tensions with the Soviet Union and with China. Hopefully they'll back us up and help end the Vietnam War, that sort of thing. But nonetheless, Nixon was still hard anti-communist as ever. He started his career as an anti-communist, and by goodness gracious, he's going to continue as an anti-communist. This being highlighted in the country of Chile. Chile. I pronounce it Chile. What happened is Chile had elected a communist president. So the United States placed an embargo on Chile, saying we're not going to trade with you because we don't like your communism. And then also the CIA, as they do, worked on undermining him. So what happened is the Chilean army happened to attack their communist president, and the president died when the Chilean army attacked his headquarters in 1973. And the U.S. Embassy embraced his successor, who happened to not be a communist. Officially we didn't do anything in Chile, but officially what actually happened is they had a communist leader, we didn't like him, we got him killed, and we put in place a guy we liked. So just as hard on communism as ever. Okay, Section E, I'll try to go quicker. A new team on the Supreme Bench. So we're talking about the Supreme Court. So remember Earl Warren? He had like all of these Supreme Court cases, which we'll talk about, that are liberal, right, changing things. Well, Nixon just didn't like Earl Warren at all. Their political philosophies were north and south, right, completely different. I'm going to go through some really important Supreme Court cases that Earl Warren kind of reigned over. Judicial activism at its finest. Here we go. Griswold versus Connecticut. This was in 1965. This created the idea of the right to privacy, which will be used later on in Roe versus Wade, like the abortion thing. Griswold versus Connecticut created the right to privacy when they struck down a law that banned the use of contraceptions. So there's a state law banning contraceptions, and Griswold versus Connecticut said that was unconstitutional. Okay, Gideon versus I can't say W's. Wainwright. Okay, Gideon's case was all criminals are entitled to have a lawyer even if they couldn't afford it. 1966, we had the Miranda trial, and that is like the Miranda rights. Those arrested had the right to remain silent and were given the Miranda warning. When you're arrested, you have the right to remain silent, and there's whole spiel. That happened during the Warren case. Also, we have Engel versus Vitale. This is 1962. Engel versus Vitale, 62. What this was is it emphasized more or less the separation of church and state, saying public schools couldn't require prayer or Bible reading. So all of these cases together, really, this is like the worst nightmare for social conservatives, for people like Nixon. They actually started to have billboards started to pop up all over the country, created by these social conservatives that said, impeach Earl Warren. He's taking the Bible out of schools. He's preventing prayer in schools. All of these things. Anyway, so what happens is Nixon, being a social conservative himself, I pronounced everything right in that sentence, praise the Lord. He decides that it's about time that he wants to change things up. So fortunately for him, 4 out of the 9 of the Supreme Court justices retire. So he actually gets to appoint, with Senate approval, 4 Supreme Court justices. So to replace Earl Warren, he nominates Earl Burger of Minnesota, and then 3 other kind of socially conservative judges. But as a lot of presidents learn the hard way, although you nominate someone who you think is a social conservative, doesn't mean that they actually are a social conservative, because once they get in that seat, once they are a Supreme Court justice, they're there to stay, so they can do whatever they want. So unfortunately for Nixon, that's what happens to him. He appoints these new 4 social conservative Supreme Court judges, and they happen to not be so conservative once they actually are officially appointed. For example, the new Burger Court, remember Earl Burger's the new Chief Justice, instead of dismantling all of these social reforms that Earl Warren made, they actually added to them. Obviously, the most controversial one being 1973 Roe versus Wade decision that legalized abortion, and that was all based off of the previous decision we talked about that established the right to privacy. So, not so socially conservative anymore, are we, Nixon? Okay. Section F. Nixon on the home front. All right, so it's kind of strange because usually Republicans are all about like, we're not going to spend money, right? So a lot of times under Republicans, we see like they don't really sponsor social programs. However, Nixon, he was actually a little bit different. Nixon actually did support a lot of social programs. He expanded welfare, increasing food stamps and Medicare, a number of other things. For example, he guaranteed the cost of living by increasing Social Security to protect the old people from inflation. Let me explain what I just said, because I didn't say it very well. The idea is like when you're living on a fixed income, inflation kills you, because you only are going to have so much a month, but things get more and more expensive. You know, that can of Pringles is going to go up like 50 cents. You know, that's horrible. So the idea is that he would guarantee an increase in Social Security, that check they got every month, that would go up to help them pay for all of the goods whose prices were increasing. So things like that. So although he is a Republican, he does support a lot of these social welfare programs. Okay, next thing he really does is extends affirmative action. And we talked about affirmative action before. Affirmative action, which you'll learn about more in government next year, is the idea that you hold certain spots, say in when like you're accepting people into a college, or when you're hiring people, you kind of set aside certain spots for minorities, for like African Americans, that sort of thing. So for example, what's going on in 1969 is something called the Philadelphia Plan, and this requires construction unions to hire black apprentices, and then later this extends to all federal contracts. So over time, all federal contracts had to kind of go along with this affirmative action, making sure a certain percentage of your employees were African American, Asian, women, that sort of thing. Okay, so this idea of affirmative action is actually upheld by the Supreme Court in 71, and this is Griggs versus Duke Power Company. So the Supreme Court upholding affirmative action that was first introduced by Nixon through the Philadelphia Plan that had to do with construction companies that were hired by the federal government. Say that 3 times fast. Okay, so critics, obviously, of the Philadelphia Plan and of affirmative action in general, they called it reverse racism, or reverse discrimination, I should say, reverse discrimination. But nonetheless, the courts and the president, they said, we're going to do this. We're going to make sure that affirmative action happens, and so it did. Okay, continuing on in Section F, we're almost done, I promise. Environmental Protection Agency. This was created in 1970, the EPA. You might still hear about that from time to time. And this is all about conservation, right? There's a famous book, The Silent Spring. It's kind of like a muckraking book, kind of pointing a finger at different problems. This was written by Rachel Carson in '62 and exposed the poisonous effects of pesticides that are used to kill little critters that are on crops. So muckraker Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, exposes poisonous effects of pesticides. April 22nd of 1970 is when the first Earth Day is created to create awareness about the Earth. Congress in 1970 also passes the Clean Air Act, Endangered Species Act passed in 1973. So we see really the 70s as an era where we're waking up to the concerns of the environment. Other things, OSHA is created. OSHA is Occupational Safety and Health Administration. If you work anywhere, you have to watch these OSHA tapes. It's usually blood-borne pathogens, how not to get in contact with blood in the workplace. Oh man, get excited about real life, folks. OSHA videos are coming your way. Also, Consumer Product Safety Commission, CPSC, created to make sure companies were not selling dangerous products. And really, all of these different things, OSHA, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, a lot of people felt like the federal government was becoming the national nanny, putting all of these regulations on businesses, and businesses were not very happy about it. But nonetheless, national nanny was there to stay. Okay. This section kind of ends just by talking about Nixon does, this is the domestic policy of Nixon. Nixon does do some interesting things economically. First thing he does is he actually takes the United States off the gold standard. This idea there is that he wanted to stimulate the exports of U.S. goods by declining or devaluing the dollar. Okay. And also to fight inflation, he does a nationwide 90-day price freeze, saying that no more inflation over the next 90 days, trying to combat that inflation. Okay, with that, I think we're finally done.